It is the year 70 AD, and the dawn over Jerusalem smells of dust and hot metal. The legionary Lucius tightens the straps on his segmenta lorica, feeling the familiar weight of 60 pounds of iron pressing down on his shoulders. Beside him, a centurion shouts orders, and 5,000 throats respond with a single, muffled roar. This moment of extreme tension before battle will be forever etched into the soldier's memory, becoming his only reality. 25 years later, he will wake up in complete silence, hear no sound of the Bucina military trumpet, and for the first time in his life, receive no orders. The morning of demobilization strikes the veteran's psyche harder than any enemy's sword. A man who has lived for a quarter of a century according to the camp's strict schedule suddenly finds himself face to face with daunting freedom. His entire personality was forged in the crucible of the Legion, where every action, from mealtime to sleep, was strictly regulated. Now he must shed this armor for the last time and step outside the fortress gates as an ordinary citizen. It is at this very moment that the great machinery of the Roman army deals its loyal cog, its final, most painful blow. This historical paradox shatters conventional notions of triumphs and glorious retirements. Next, we'll examine the system that methodically destroyed the recruit's old identity and created the perfect killing machine. We'll look at the honorable discharge ceremony, known as the honors domitio, and the bronze diploma that became the most important document in a veteran's life. The Roman military bureaucracy had thought through the discharge process down to the smallest detail, distributing land and money with frightening meticulousness. But behind the beautiful facades of the colonies lay a dark side to the return to civilian life, one that is rarely mentioned in textbooks. You'll learn why the ancient historians Tacitus and Plutarch described the condition of veterans using the same terms as modern psychiatrists. We'll compare the mortality rates of retired legionnaires with data on modern soldiers experiencing an identity crisis. It turns out that 2,000 years ago, the Empire faced a problem that the US military still hasn't been able to fully resolve. The story of one legionary will help us understand how the state system grinds people down for the sake of the Empire's survival. And the most interesting part lies in exactly how the Romans tried to save the sanity of their best warriors. But to understand the end of this journey, we need to look into the eyes of those who created this ruthless structure. It all began in the year 6 CE, when Emperor Octavian Augustus realized one very simple and frightening thing. The old militia system no longer worked because soldiers didn't want to fight for free and demanded land after every campaign. Augustus established the military treasury, the aerarium militara, forever changing the rules of the game in the ancient world. From that moment on, service in the Legion became a full-fledged profession with a 25-year contract. By modern standards, this sounds like a life sentence, but for a poor peasant, it was the only path to social mobility. The Empire offered a deal that was impossible to refuse. You give up your youth, and Rome makes you a wealthy man. However, Octavian Augustus understood that simply paying a salary was not enough to create ideal military discipline. It was necessary to completely destroy the recruit's old civic identity and build a new, system-oriented person from those fragments. The moment a legionary took the military oath, the sacramentum, he literally ceased to belong to himself and became the official property of the state. He was strictly forbidden from entering into a legal marriage for the duration of his service, so that nothing would distract him from carrying out orders. Modern corporations sometimes demand complete dedication from their employees, but the Romans elevated this grim principle to an absolute. But before taking the oath, every candidate underwent a rigorous selection process known as probatio. The military theorist Vegetius wrote that the army preferred to recruit blacksmiths and hunters, rejecting pampered city dwellers. Recruits were tested for height, eyesight, and endurance, and the weak were weeded out without the slightest regret. If a man failed to pass the probationary period, he was sent home in disgrace or assigned to hard labor brigades. And this is where things get really interesting, because those who passed the selection faced physical exertion beyond the limits of human endurance. A legionnaire's daily routine consisted of endless 18-mile marches and building fortified camps every night. The Roman general Gnaeus Julius Agricola brilliantly employed this grueling tactic during his arduous campaigns in harsh Britain. Agricola knew full well that a soldier exhausted by constant physical labor simply had no time for panic or doubt. Modern sports psychologists call this stress management through monotonous, repetitive actions, while the Romans called it iron discipline. When the body is engaged in hard labor at the limit of its capabilities, the brain automatically shuts off fear and focuses exclusively on survival. Moreover, soldiers covered this entire distance not in comfortable boots, but in stiff leather sandals called caligae. The soles of these sandals were studded with dozens of iron nails to ensure perfect traction on any mud or slippery rocks. Each legionnaire carried about 60 pounds of equipment, effectively becoming a self-sufficient mobile base. The commander Gnaeus Domitius Corbulo forced his troops to undertake such grueling marches even in the depths of winter, amid the snows of Armenia. Such a burden seems insane, but it was precisely this that prepared the soldiers for the ultimate test of survival in the wilderness. In every Roman camp, everything was standardized to the point of paranoia, from the exact size of the tents to the guard rotation schedule. Every 8 men lived together in one leather tent, forming a basic military unit called a contubernium. For years, these men shared meager rations, ground grain together, and covered for one another in the bloody carnage of close combat. If one soldier committed an act of cowardice on the battlefield, severe punishment often fell on all his comrades. This system of collective responsibility created psychological bonds stronger than family ties, binding the soldiers to one another inextricably. In the US Army, a similar principle for fostering combat brotherhood is called unit cohesion, but Roman commanders implemented it 2,000 years ago. For a legionary, losing such a comrade in battle was harder than learning of the death of his own brother in distant Italy. But there was also a terrifying dark side to this system, in the form of the infamous punishment known as decimation. If an entire cohort fled, the legionaries would, by lot, stone or club to death every 10th of their comrades. This sounds utterly barbaric, but the fear of execution at the hands of one's own comrades proved more effective than any enemy threat. The historian Josephus was genuinely amazed by this system when he wrote that Roman training was like real battles without bloodshed. The wooden training weapons weighed twice as much as the real ones, causing the muscles to burn like hellfire during every session. Today, sports physiologists call this the principle of progressive overload, which is actively used in the training of modern Olympic champions. The Roman instructors, the campi doctors, knew nothing of physiology, but they understood perfectly well that hard training guaranteed an easy battle for a legionary. They methodically forged soldiers whose muscle memory would react faster than their minds could even register the approaching ranks of barbarians. Every day, recruits struck a post, driven into the ground up to 1,000 times with a heavy wooden sword. Modern fitness trainers would faint at the thought of such a devastating strain on the joints. However, Roman officers knew that in the conditions of hours-long, non-stop battle, only those whose arms did not drop from exhaustion would survive. After 4 months of this hellish training, a real steel gladius weighing 2 pounds felt as light as a feather to a legionary. And this is where the story gets even more interesting, because the order of this conveyor belt of death was overseen by truly unique individuals. The famous centurions, who formed the backbone of every Roman legion, played a significant role in this harsh psychological conditioning. Tacitus, in his Annals mentions the centurion Lucilius, who was given the sarcastic nickname Cedo Alterum by the soldiers, meaning, "Give me another one." When he broke his vine branch over the back of a legionary who had committed an offense, he immediately demanded that the next stick be brought to him. It sounds like outright sadism, but it was precisely this ruthless strictness that kept the ranks from falling apart during the critical moments of battle. The soldiers feared their centurion more than they feared armed enemies, and this was a brilliant psychological calculation on the part of the high command. But it would be a colossal mistake to regard these commanders as mere safe overseers, hiding behind the backs of their subordinates. Centurions always stood in the front row of the formation, taking the brunt of the advancing enemy's attack. That is precisely why the mortality rate among these junior officers was historically the highest in the entire Roman army. In his notes, Julius Caesar regularly praised the centurions who, at the cost of their own lives, saved entire cohorts from total annihilation. Respect for them was based not only on fear of corporal punishment, but also on an unshakable confidence in their personal courage. But this everyday harshness was always interspersed with moments of profound order and sincere concern for the survival of each individual soldier. The Romans established the best military medical system in the ancient world, equipping every legion with professional doctors and experienced surgeons. Soldiers knew for certain that the empire would spare no resources to pull them off the battlefield and carefully stitch up their wounds. The wounded were given a powerful opium-based painkiller, and their cuts were treated with an antibacterial solution made from ordinary vinegar and honey. The military machine was incredibly harsh, but it never left its most valuable assets to fend for themselves. Every permanent camp included a spacious hospital, known by the Latin name valetudinarium. Doctors understood perfectly well that infections and diseases killed far more people in war than enemy swords or arrows. Therefore, the Romans observed hygiene with maniacal thoroughness, building well-designed sewage systems and safe latrines. Drinking water was always boiled or mixed with sour wine, creating a safe beverage to quench thirst during long marches. This gave soldiers a vital sense of security, which was so sorely lacking in the chaotic barbarian militias of that time. Over the course of 25 years of this unique way of life, a man would completely lose touch with civilian life and his original family. His entire future outlook was reduced to the next march, guard duty, or the sweet day of receiving his silver pay. He grew accustomed to every action having a clear purpose, approved by his commander, and reinforced by ancient religious rituals. In modern psychology, this is called institutionalization, a state in which a person becomes utterly helpless outside the framework of their familiar structure. For Rome, this was the ideal way to prevent the empire from falling apart by creating a closed caste of praetorians and professional legionaries. Even when the army was stationed in peaceful provinces, the legionaries continued to live in their own isolated social bubble. Around the camps, civilian settlements known as canabae sprang up, where merchants, local artisans, and the soldiers' unofficial wives lived. But the fortress's stone wall always separated these two worlds, reminding the soldier that he was an instrument of the state. This artificial barrier slowly warped their psyche, training them to be unable to make even the simplest everyday decisions on their own. And this is where the harsh realities of the economy came into play, turning these traumatized people into a historical problem. The economics of this military system seemed utterly insane, as the army consumed up to 70% of the entire state budget. Modern developed nations spend about 3% on defense, so the scale of Roman militarization is difficult to even comprehend today. Each individual legionary was too costly and risky an investment to simply cast out onto the streets once his contract ended. The state understood perfectly well that if these professional killers were deprived of a stable income, they would quickly find themselves a new, ambitious master. It sounds frightening, but it was precisely the fear of its own defenders that forced the Senate to seek a way out of this stalemate. Augustus keenly realized that 100,000 unemployed and angry veterans were a direct path to yet another devastating civil war. Allowing them to remain in the capital was tantamount to political suicide, so the empire devised a mechanism for integrating them into the distant provinces. That is precisely why the system of honorable discharge was devised just as meticulously as the most complex tactics for besieging fortified enemy cities. Every coin and every plot of land was distributed according to strict regulations to ensure that any potential discontent among former soldiers was quelled. Now imagine how this cold-blooded mechanism worked in practice on that very fateful day of farewell to the legion. But no matter how perfectly this military bureaucracy functioned, it could not override human nature. After 25 years of service, a soldier approached the end of his contract, not merely weary, but a man completely transformed from within. He had become the perfect instrument, one that no longer had a use in the peaceful cities of the empire. What happened at that very moment when the instrument was solemnly sent off to a well-deserved retirement? In the next stage of this historical journey, we encounter a ritual that was meant to restore a man's life to him. The day of honorable retirement, Honostomisho, began with the entire legion forming in solemn formation on the camp's main parade ground. A veteran, having endured 25 years of marches and bloodshed, stepped forward before the ranks to receive his final award. The commanding legate delivered an official speech, praising the valor of the departing soldiers on behalf of the reigning emperor himself. At that moment, the veteran would officially remove his lorica segmentata armor and surrender his service weapon to the arsenal. It sounds beautiful, but for many, it was a moment of profound psychological shock, comparable to the loss of a part of their own body. Having removed his armor, the legionary physically felt a vulnerability he had forgotten after a quarter-century of constant protection. The main physical symbol of this day was the famous bronze diploma, consisting of 2 plaques fastened together with copper wire. This piece of metal, weighing about 1 pound, was the most important document in the life of any retiring soldier of antiquity. It took several days of painstaking work by an engraver to create it, as the text was chiseled onto a hard surface, letter by letter. The original of this document always remained in Rome and was nailed to the wall of the temple on Capitoline Hill for permanent safekeeping. The veteran received only a certified copy, which he carried with him as the primary proof of his social status. This diploma possessed true legal magic, transforming a disenfranchised provincial into a full-fledged citizen of the great empire. The document officially legitimized veterans' marriages to local women, granting them the so-called right of connubium. Until that moment, any relationship a legionary had was considered invalid, and his own children had no legal claim to their father's inheritance. Upon receiving the coveted bronze certificate, a soldier instantly legalized his entire family, integrating them into the rigid legal system of Roman society. Modern immigration services spend years processing such statuses, while the Romans settled the matter with a single stroke of the gavel. It is interesting to consider the reaction of Emperor Claudius, who, in the 40s CE, streamlined the issuance of such certificates. Claudius had just conquered Britain and understood perfectly well that maintaining a massive garrison there was too costly and incredibly dangerous. The emperor decided that assimilating retired veterans into the conquered territories was the cheapest way to secure the loyalty of the rebellious provinces. By issuing citizenship certificates, Rome created a reliable base of pro-Roman families right on the borders of its sphere of influence. These people became a living shield for the empire, defending their new homes from raids by their former, unruly tribesmen. The empire's bureaucratic machine operated with frightening precision, preventing any fraud involving the acquisition of valuable veteran benefits. Each certificate meticulously listed the full names of 7 independent witnesses who were present at its ceremonial sealing. If a local official doubted the document's authenticity, he could always send an official request to the Central Tabularium Archive in the capital. No one could simply claim the prestigious rights of a veteran or challenge his lawful pension in a provincial court. Modern bureaucracy takes immense pride in its electronic databases, but the Romans achieved perfect record-keeping without electricity. But the most interesting part began when it came to actual payments. Along with his diploma, a veteran was entitled to a colossal cash payment, the premia militiae, amounting to exactly 3,000 denarii. This was a truly fantastic sum, equivalent to roughly 13 years of continuous service by an ordinary Roman legionary. Octavian Augustus created a separate military treasury specifically for this purpose, which was consistently replenished by a strict 5% inheritance tax. Imagine if a modern soldier, upon discharge, were to receive a decade's worth of salary in cash, tax-free. It sounds like the perfect start to a whole new life, but cash was handed out in person, extremely rarely. The state was terrified of a situation in which a crowd of wealthy, bored old men would begin to drink away their fortunes en masse in the capital. Politicians remembered all too well the days of the Republic, when drunken veterans staged bloody riots in the streets of Rome, aggressively demanding respect. Therefore, more often than not, this money was distributed in the form of ready-to-use plots of land in special veterans' colonies on the outskirts of the state. This ingenious solution killed two birds with one stone. It removed dangerous people from the center and provided free security for the unstable borders. The Romans paid their soldiers with their own futures, forcing them to settle wild and inhospitable territories. One such famous colony was the city of Timgad in North Africa, built by Emperor Trajan in the year 100. This city was constructed by soldiers of the 3rd Augustan Legion, specifically for their senior comrades who were retiring to a well-deserved rest. Timgad was designed to closely resemble a military camp, with a perfect square grid of paved streets intersecting at right angles. Why build a peaceful civilian city in the form of a fortified structure in a place where there had long been no serious military threat? Because Trajan fully understood the fragile psychology of soldiers who vitally needed familiar geometric landmarks. A veteran could walk through Timgad with his eyes closed without feeling the panic caused by the chaotic layout of typical ancient cities. The arrangement of the central forum and public baths perfectly mirrored the layout of the command tents in a typical field camp. For a man who, for a quarter of a century, had seen nothing but the straight lines of marching routes and the sharp angles of trenches, this was a true respite from stress. The urban architecture served as a kind of spatial antidepressant, reducing the anxiety levels of these former killing machines. However, even the smoothest streets could not compensate for the most terrible loss in the life of a retired legionnaire. Moving to such a colony almost always meant permanently severed ties with comrades in arms from the camp's close-knit circle. Plots of land were allocated by blind lottery, which mercilessly scattered close friends to different corners of the vast province. For a man who had fallen asleep to the breathing of the same 7 people for 25 years, this was a total life catastrophe. In essence, in a single short day, the veteran lost the only family he knew and set off into the void to settle on unfamiliar ground. Modern psychologists claim that the sudden loss of a social group inflicts damage on the brain, comparable to severe physical trauma. Now, this ruthless professional killer was supposed to become a peaceful farmer, methodically cultivating olive trees and wheat. But the main problem was that, for the past few decades, his only farming tool had been an exceptionally sharp gladius sword. Roman agricultural science required in-depth knowledge of the phases of the moon, soil types, and complex irrigation systems. The veteran knew absolutely nothing about any of this, feeling like a helpless idiot on his own legally owned plot of land. The empire provided for its heroes materially, but completely ignored their deepest inner crises. And this is where historical reality becomes truly grim. Ancient sources record a frightening but entirely logical fact. Many veterans tried to remain in the army at any cost. They submitted petitions en masse for the position of so-called evocates, voluntarily returning to service after the end of their mandatory contract. The status of an evocate entitled one to double the standard silver pay and completely exempted one from humiliating menial camp labor, such as digging trenches. The distinguishing mark of such a person was a special grapevine insignia, emphasizing his elite status among the ordinary rank-and-file recruits. However, money and outward prestige were merely a convenient pretext for returning to his familiar, aggressive environment. The real reason lay in an insurmountable, primal fear of the silence of civilian life, when no one issued strict schedules or orders. Today, military psychologists call this condition severe separation anxiety, in which a person clings maniacally to a traumatic system for the sake of an illusion of safety. The US Army faces a similar problem today, as experienced sergeants re-enlist simply out of fear of the unknowns of civilian life. A Roman legionnaire would have preferred to face a roaring crowd of Britons again, rather than deal with the mundane problems of a poor cabbage harvest. And this severe psychological breakdown began long before the construction of comfortable veteran towns in Africa. The outstanding Roman general Gaius Marius was the first to confront this destructive social dependency as early as the 2nd century BCE. It was his radical reforms of 107 BCE that created the professional legionaries, whom the patricians contemptuously dubbed Marius's mules among the people. Marius began recruiting utterly destitute Roman citizens into the army, for whom war had become the only way to avoid starvation. These people had no farms of their own to return to, so the legion became their true home for life. By creating the world's first invincible army of the poor, Marius unwittingly gave rise to a generation of people who were physically incapable of living without constant war. The general bitterly observed that his celebrated veterans lost their basic will to live incredibly quickly in peacetime. They would sit around all day in cheap taverns, drowning their sorrows in watered-down wine and frightening the locals with their scars. These men were absolute kings on the blood-soaked battlefield, but proved utterly helpless in the quiet civilian world. A man capable of withstanding a head-on charge by war elephants would instantly break down at the mere thought of having to plan the winter wheat planting for the following year. And even if they tried to become successful landowners, their old army habits made them unbearable and dangerous neighbors. Not even the monumental architecture of the new colonies could compensate for the absence of the familiar adrenaline rush and the rigid social hierarchy of the military camp. Former centurions tried to manage the agricultural slaves they had purchased in exactly the same way they had managed soldiers, using brutal stick and carrot discipline. But the slaves had not taken the sacred military oath, so such farms constantly suffered from bloody riots, quiet sabotage, and low crop yields. The veteran genuinely did not understand why his ideal command skills failed completely in a field planted with fodder beans. Out of habit, he tried to solve the problem with brute force, which only exacerbated his total isolation from the local civilian community. The former privates behaved no better and were constantly in conflict with the local civilian authorities over the slightest everyday matter. They were accustomed to resolving any disputes that arose exclusively through physical force, a mindset cultivated in them for centuries by the invincible legion. Their integration into society resembled a ridiculous attempt to insert a massive gear from a siege catapult into the mechanism of a delicate water clock. The system inevitably creaked and broke down, and ordinary citizens gradually began to quietly hate the very heroes who had ensured their safety. But this social conflict was merely a prelude to a true internal catastrophe. Thus, the great Roman machine created a social time bomb, embedded in the very foundation of every province. The honest amicia ceremony, following a triumph, often marked the beginning of the end for many of the empire's distinguished soldiers. We have arrived at the most complex question: what was going on in a soldier's mind during the first months after discharge? Why are historical chronicles rife with accounts of strange deaths and the rapid decline of once robust veterans? The answer to this question overturns our understanding of ancient psychology and leads straight into the offices of modern psychiatrists. The Roman historian Cornelius Tacitus left a frighteningly accurate description in his writings of the state of legionaries after discharge. He wrote that veterans wandered through their lands like shadows, deprived of their inner core and sense of purpose. During the first 2 years after demobilization, the mortality rate among former soldiers rose sharply for unexplained reasons. Sturdy men who had survived dozens of bloody battles and epidemics died from common illnesses or took their own lives. Ancient physicians attempted to treat this with herbal decoctions, believing the cause lay in an imbalance of black bile in the body. But the problem lay not in the body, but in the professional warrior's mind, shattered to its very foundations. Plutarch, another great thinker of that era, noted with alarm that many veterans irrevocably lost the ability to take joy in ordinary, peaceful achievements. They would sit for hours in the Thermopolia, constantly recounting their old, bloody campaigns, obsessively returning to moments of extreme tension. Today, this grim phenomenon is officially documented as post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition widely recognized in modern military medicine. The brain of a professional soldier conditioned for decades to be constantly on the lookout for mortal danger, simply refuses to switch off its heightened state of combat readiness. Any copper basin that happened to fall over in the market, or a sudden movement by a drunk neighbor in a tavern, would trigger an instantaneous muscular reaction. At such moments, the veteran's body would reflexively release massive doses of adrenaline, preparing the body for immediate hand-to-hand combat. Modern neuroscientists know full well that this is the result of physical changes in the amygdala caused by chronic stress. But ancient physicians did not have MRI machines and sincerely believed that the problem lay in a dangerous excess of black bile in the body. They prescribed purgative diets and bloodletting to former legionnaires, which only further depleted their already weakened strength. Physiology prevailed over logic, turning every other veteran into a ticking time bomb in the midst of a peaceful city. And this mass identity crisis reached truly terrifying proportions during the reign of one of the wisest emperors. This psychological breakdown became strikingly evident after Emperor Marcus Aurelius' large-scale and grueling campaigns against the savage Germanic tribes. Marcus Aurelius, a philosopher on the throne, watched with horror as his finest elite cohorts burned out mentally in endless winter encampments along the Danube. The war against the Marcomanni was so brutal and grueling that the Romans had to fight knee-deep in icy mud amid impenetrable forests. The enemy refused to surrender, constantly staging nighttime ambushes and performing ritual sacrifices of captured Roman soldiers. Even the iron discipline of the invincible legions began to crack under the pressure of such primal, irrational terror. In his famous Meditations the emperor desperately sought a philosophical, stoic justification for all this inhuman suffering. He urged his soldiers to accept their cruel fate as the highest duty, maintaining inner calm in the face of imminent death. But refined stoicism was astonishingly of little help to a man who woke up every night in a cold sweat from memories of the screams of his comrades being burned alive. The empire could grant land, bestow silver, and build a beautiful house, but it could not erase these nightmares from the legionnaires' memories. Philosophy proved powerless against trauma, and the social chasm between the soldier and society made the situation utterly unbearable. The abrupt severing of old military ties greatly exacerbated the problem, making reintegration into society a virtually impossible task for an elderly veteran. In the military camp, a man's status was strictly and fairly determined by his personal bravery, impeccable obedience, and the respect he commanded from his comrades. A veteran could take pride in his gruesome scars and combat decorations, which clearly demonstrated his unquestionable value to the state. But in the bustling civilian world, these bloody achievements suddenly lost all meaning and yielded no practical benefit. Here, the rules of the game were entirely different, and the old warrior quickly discovered that no one was interested in his glorious past. In peaceful cities, social status depended on noble birth, the ability to speak eloquently in the forum, or a talent for successfully trading in olive oil. The rough veteran, accustomed to straightforward orders, possessed none of these refined civilian skills. Patricians and shrewd merchants often openly mocked the straightforwardness of former legionnaires, easily deceiving them when concluding business deals. As a result, the war hero quickly felt cheated, unwanted, and utterly useless in this new, hypocritical environment. Modern sociologists call this cruel process marginalization, when a person loses their former high status and rapidly falls to the bottom of the social ladder. Unable to adapt honestly, many disillusioned veterans banded together into well-organized criminal gangs. In Rome during the late Republic, such groups of former soldiers professionally terrorized the streets, obeying the orders of wealthy senators. The famous general Lucius Cornelius Sulla was the first to actively use his loyal veterans to intimidate political opponents. He generously distributed confiscated enemy lands among them, turning retired soldiers into his own personal mafia, loyal to the death. These tough guys found a new, highly lucrative way to apply their specific combat skills in peacetime. Gradually, such veteran gangs turned the narrow streets of the world's capital into a zone of constant localized hostilities. They could easily disrupt unfavorable elections, beat up an unwelcome tribune, or burn down a rival's house at the mere nod of their patron. The state had created with its own hands an obedient and deadly monster, which it was later unable to sustain through peaceful, lawful means. As a result, Rome paid dearly for this short-sightedness, with decades of devastating civil wars that bled the Great Republic dry. And this was a colossal systemic failure that modern states would do well to study much more closely. Now just consider the striking, frightening parallel between the ancient Romans and modern veterans of the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Today, the US Department of Veterans Affairs allocates billions of dollars annually to special psychological rehabilitation programs for former service members. Rehabilitation centers are built for them, the best psychotherapists are hired, and complex courses of medication are developed. Despite all these enormous efforts and budgets, the suicide rate among demobilized soldiers has remained tragically high for many decades. Modern technology has changed the appearance of weapons beyond recognition, but it has not altered the fragile structure of the human psyche in the slightest. Just as in harsh ancient Rome, the modern army is highly skilled at transforming an ordinary civilian into the ideal soldier. Instructors spend long months at boot camp, methodically breaking down a person's individuality and integrating them into the unit's strict hierarchy. But no modern superpower in history has ever learned how to effectively transform a soldier back into a happy, peaceful citizen. There is no reverse training camp where a person would be just as methodically taught to trust strangers again and sleep without a weapon. The Romans didn't have such a well-thought-out system either, but they desperately tried to find a way out of the situation using their own, very specific methods. Roman doctors and commanders attempted to create primitive rehabilitation programs entirely intuitively, drawing on ancient medicine and simple trial and error. They persistently advised jittery veterans to visit public baths daily to relax and soothe their frayed nerves. The hot mineral springs were indeed excellent at relieving the chronic muscle spasms that had built up over decades of wearing heavy iron armor. The water, intense massage, and use of aromatic oils helped the exhausted body remember what it meant to live without constant physical strain. But even the empire's finest bath attendants could not, with the help of a bronze scraper, heal the deep psychological trauma in a veteran's wounded soul. Realizing that ancient medicine was powerless, many legionnaires found their only salvation in religion, joining en masse the mystical cult of the invincible Mithras. This stern Eastern deity was incredibly popular precisely among career soldiers, and his sanctuaries were always built secretly underground. Mithraism, with its strict male hierarchy, closed secret meetings, and brutal trials of the spirit, perfectly mirrored the structure of army brotherhood. Within this mysterious cult, a lost veteran could once again feel at home among his own kind, interacting exclusively with battle-tested comrades. In essence, it was a unique form of ancient group therapy, allowing broken warriors to once again feel like an important part of something greater. At the beginning of the 3rd century, Emperor Septimius Severus finally realized the scale of the catastrophe and attempted to solve this problem as radically as possible. Through a special historical decree, he officially permitted all active duty soldiers to live with their families throughout their long terms of service. He generously allowed legionnaires to legally engage in farming right outside the walls of the border military camps. The emperor sincerely hoped to blur the rigid boundary between traumatic military life and peaceful civilian life, making the transition to retirement smoother. On the one hand, this did indeed sharply reduce the shock of discharge, since veterans already had a home and an established way of life on the border. On the other hand, however, this well-intentioned humanitarian initiative dealt a crushing blow to the mobility and iron discipline of the legions themselves. Soldiers, deeply attached to their wives, young children, and newly planted vineyards, categorically refused to march to other provinces on orders. The once invincible strike force of professionals began to rapidly transform into a sluggish, sedentary, and lazy peasant militia. From then on, the legionnaires preferred to defend not some abstract great empire, but exclusively their own personal vegetable garden and the crooked wooden fence surrounding it. The attempt to save the soldiers' fragile morale ultimately led to a fatal weakening of the very military machine that had defended Rome's borders against the barbarians for centuries. This is a classic historical trap from which no powerful state on the planet has yet found a perfect way out. You either have a ruthless, ultra-efficient army that grinds people down, or you build a safe society of happy and peaceful citizens. Rome always cynically chose military efficiency, cold-bloodedly writing off broken people as scrap, in order to maintain geopolitical dominance in a turbulent region. The state pragmatically viewed its aging veterans as dulled swords. They had done their job, and now they could simply be discarded. But the price of this much-vaunted ancient efficiency was measured in tens of thousands of ruined lives. The very lives of the young men who had given Rome the best years of their youth. The famous historian Tacitus understood this perfectly, describing with undisguised bitterness how the great empire methodically devoured its own loyal defenders. He clearly saw that behind every glittering marble triumph lay a vast army of ghosts, living people whose souls had been forever destroyed. And therein lies the main, still unlearned lesson of the ancient war machine, one that resonates today more than ever before. We've taken a detailed look at how the state system created and destroyed its heroes on a colossal, industrial scale. Now let's return to our legionnaire, Lucius, and see what this global crisis looked like through the eyes of an ordinary man on his first morning of peace. We've traveled the path from the harsh training camp to the tragic finale in a veterans' colony somewhere on the empire's outskirts. Now, it's time to return to that very same legionnaire, Lucius, who is experiencing his first morning without orders. How does his personal story bring this entire complex historical process full circle, tying the past and the present together? What will his first step be in a new world where there are no more enemies, but also no longer the saving grace of camp routine? The answer lies in the very last, most difficult decision that a professional soldier of antiquity must make. Veteran Lucius stands in the doorway of his new stone house, holding a heavy bronze diploma in his hands. The centurion's orders no longer ring in his ears, and before his eyes stand no rows of enemies armed to the teeth. 25 years ago, in Jerusalem, he feared death by the sword, but now he feels a completely new, paralyzing fear. It is the fear of silence, the fear of freedom, and the fear of the life he must build from scratch at the age of 45. But the system that shattered his old self left him with one vital thing: an iron will to survive. The Roman Empire was not kind. It was pragmatic to the core, and its soldiers reflected that pragmatism. Lucius sets his diploma aside, picks up a hoe, and, with the same methodical precision with which he built the camp, sets out to till the land. He channels his anxiety into work, applying camp discipline to keep from going mad from the emptiness. Many of his comrades will not survive this crisis, fading into history as mere dry mortality statistics. But those who pass this final test will lay the foundation for new cities that will stand for another 1,000 years. Modern states continue to make the same mistakes, spending billions on weapons and pennies on the rehabilitation of souls. Psychiatry has given fancy names to traumas, but the recipe for salvation has largely remained at the level of ancient Mithraism and discipline. We are still searching for a way to restore a person's identity after the state has taken it away in the name of defending its borders. The history of Rome proves that technological progress changes the materials of armor, but the human psyche remains unchanged for centuries. What Plutarch described 2,000 years ago is being discussed today in veterans' clinics around the world. And therein lies the greatest historical irony. The hardest battle in a Roman soldier's life was not a skirmish with barbarians in the dense Germanic forests. The hardest battle was the first day after an honorable discharge, when his own memory became his enemy. Victory went not to the one who swung his sword the hardest, but to the one who found the strength within himself to become an ordinary person. And this trial required a kind of courage that was not taught in any of the empire's military camps.